Hi everyone, and welcome to my fourth video now, and a very special hello to Serious Mind, who is my first subscriber now that I'm back on YouTube, hopefully going to be contributing more. I apologize for the long absence, just had a lot going on with work and everything else. So anyway, today we're going to be talking about, as the title indicates, the formation of the Pentateuch. Now, the traditional view of the Pentateuch, those being the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. That's Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. So the traditional view is that Moses is the author of these 5 books. It's a rabbinic tradition that prefaces the section of the Pentateuch with Moses said. So Paul does this in his writings in Romans 10:5. Jesus says it at Mark 7:10 and at John 7:22. So again, the very traditional view is that Moses had written them. Now, in the Middle Ages, though, people who were critical of this view noted that there was a problem with the last few verses in Deuteronomy, which is the last book of the Pentateuch, which namely describes Moses' death. This is at Deuteronomy chapter 34, verses 5 through 12. Some people wrote it off as saying that Joshua, who took leadership of the Israelites after Moses, at least in the biblical tradition, that he may have authored it. But others may have said that Moses was also a prophet, which is at chapter 34, verse 10, and that he foresaw his own death. It was divine revelation to him. And this went relatively unchallenged until the 17th century. In the 17th century, aside from having philosophers like Thomas Hobbes or Baruch Spinoza who really challenged this idea, we also have someone by the name of Father Richard Simon, who was a French Catholic priest. He wrote a book called The Critical History of the Old Testament. And in it, he established that Moses was not the author for several reasons. One is that the Pentateuch makes historical claims that Moses would not have been privy to, that he would have not had any knowledge of. It includes mention of the Philistines, who did not arrive in Palestine until 100 years after the date of the Exodus, or after the date of, Moses' life and death. In Genesis 36:31, it speaks of the Israelites being ruled by kings, which didn't happen until King Saul, which is several centuries after Moses. There's also geographical oddities, like Moses died east of the Jordan River, and never mentioned the Promised Land. So in Deuteronomy 1:1, it shows the words that Moses spoke to all Israel across the Jordan. The Pentateuch also is not a first-person narrative. Nowhere in the text does it suggest that Moses wrote it or that Moses is the one transcribing the piece. On top of that, there is something called the documentary hypothesis, which I forget, but I may have mentioned in one of my last videos. Documentary hypothesis was produced or put together by Julius Wellhausen, who's a professor at the University of Greifswald in Germany. Pardon me, I'm getting over a cold. He had noticed that the Pentateuch was not written by eyewitnesses, which is the big thing. And the views of the authors, there are several views, basically. There are several authors assumed to have written them. They go by the names of J, E, P, and D, or the sources are called J, E, P, and D, that construct an evolutionary model of the development of the religious and ancient tradition of Israel. So Wellhausen's views were rather anti-Semitic, with no historical value, and that there was no historical value in the Pentateuch. It was not shared by others. The documentary hypothesis was meant more as a literary criticism. It is a source analysis, more or less. Very much like how we can do a literary analysis of the 4 gospel accounts, and we can determine that Mark is very likely the main source, and the original gospel account that other books like Matthew and Luke are based off of, where Matthew uses roughly 90% and Luke uses roughly 50%. It is believed that Mark had a hypothetical source. They call it hypothetical because we have no written evidence of it, called the Q document, which is short for Quell, which is German. and is believed to be a collection of sayings by Jesus of Nazareth. So the sources, very much like Q, are hypothetical. We have no individual scrolls or any papyrus or any other type of written document that shows these different sections broken up the way we believe them to have originally been. Just the documentary hypothesis is the best explanation that we have. It helps us figure out the inconsistencies of whether God was called Yahweh before Moses' time, and made it possible to isolate the different sources in Genesis. And all the sources in the Pentateuch after Genesis use Yahweh. Now, the first source, the J source, we call them the J author, or just J. J stood for Yahwist, but because it came from Germany, Yahweh is spelled with a J and not a Y. So Yahweh, or the J author, uses anthropomorphisms, meaning there's very human-like qualities given to God. We see this like in the Garden of Eden, where God is walking around at chapter 2, verse 4 to chapter 3, verse 24. God shuts the door on the ark. He smells a pleasing odor after the flood, after the sacrifice that Noah gives to him after the flood. God goes down to view the Tower of Babel. He has a meal with Abraham. He bargains for the people of Sodom. He bargains with Abraham. He meets and tries to kill Moses. He also does this to Jacob, who ends up becoming Israel. The J author primarily is concerned with the ancestors of Israel. See this at Genesis chapter 12 through 50. It's in the territory of Judah, the southern tribal kingdom. Jacob's son is featured prominently in the narratives as well. So the J author also writes that the father of Moses is Reuel, as opposed to Jethro, which we see in Exodus 3, 1 through 18, 1, which is an E source idea. So Jethro is written about by the E source, which we'll get to in a minute. Mount Sinai is where Moses gets the law, not Mount Horeb. And the boundary of the Promised Land runs from the river of Egypt to the Euphrates. The territory is controlled by David and Solomon, hence the dating is to roughly the 10th century BCE, when King David would have been in power. And J is the fullest of the four sources that we have, and it's read as a fairly continuous narrative. Now, the E stands for Elohist. The reason for this title is because this author frequently refers to God as Elohim. It's fragmentary, though, and it's truncated when it's contributed with J. They run fairly smoothly when they're put together. It begins at approximately Genesis 15 and occurs from Genesis 20 onward. God is rather remote in this one. He's revealed through dreams, through angels, and the prophets, and only E is Abraham, labeled as a prophet. This is also true of Miriam. We see it Exodus 15:20 and Numbers 11:29 and 12:6. The setting of the E, of where E was written, is viewed as being in the northern kingdom of Ephraim, rather than Judah, like where the J author would have placed them. This dates to roughly the 9th century BCE. And this author, because it's truncated with E, is sometimes called the JE source. It's somewhat difficult to separate these two if we don't have those other little bits that I've just labeled for you. Now, the D author isn't important to us at this point because this is the author that's predominantly responsible for the Deuteronomy story. That's why it's called D, Deuteronomist. The core of the book was discovered in the temple during the reign of Josiah, the king of Judah, late in the 7th century BCE. It's probably originated in the northern kingdom, very much like E did. That's all we really need to know for right now. We'll get to more about Deuteronomy later. Now with P, the P source is called that because it was believed to have been written by priestly authors. There's an emphasis on the religious observance and ritual, obviously being priestly authors. The Genesis creation, 2:23, the divine rest and the Sabbath, there's the observance of the details of the dietary law, the ancestral narration, the command to Abraham for circumcision, God is Elohim until the divine name is revealed to Moses in Exodus 6. And God is even more remote and transcendent, and there's never a direct appearance of God like there is in the J narrative, or indirectly like in E. So God manifests in glory. So there's light-filled clouds. There's the sun behind the clouds. It reveals God's divine presence, and it conceals him at the same time. The J author has the covenant with Abraham. J and E describe the covenant as being at Sinai or Horeb, but P has a thematic series of the covenants. So the first is with Noah and his descendants, with the bow in the sky. The second is with Abraham and circumcision. And the third is with God and Israel. And this is mediated by Moses on Mount Sinai. The final editor of all four of these sources is believed to be P, and mostly because the opening and the ending of the Pentateuch, so the beginning of Genesis, the end of Deuteronomy, have a lot of priestly influences. So it's believed that the P author, because of this, among other reasons, took the 5 books, put them together, and added their own creative elements to it. So first, he's responsible for the first Genesis creation story, the last chapter of Deuteronomy. He framed the Torah. It connects J and E with the genealogies, the generations of heaven and earth at Genesis 2:4. He's concerned with the matters of ritual and religious observance in Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. The sacrificial system is important to him. Moses and his brother Aaron, who was the first priest, are central to the schematic presentation. So generally, anytime you hear about Aaron or read about anything that Aaron as a priest is doing that's important, it is done by the P author. And there's also a list of no sacrifices before Moses' time, according to the P author. And because of all this, it's viewed to have been added in or written the latest, which is roughly around the 6th century BCE. Now, J and E were independently written in Judah and Ephraim, 10th to 9th centuries, respectively. Ephraim was a northern kingdom which was attacked in 722 BCE by the Assyrians. The Assyrian, not exile, but there was attack by the Assyrians. There's a much better term that I can't think of right this second. But this attack also brought the E source to Jerusalem, which was combined with J. And in the 6th century BCE, P shaped all these sources and put them together with his own material and with Deuteronomy into the Pentateuch. So the documentary hypothesis is challenged by much more conservative theologians, much more conservative scholars, because they view it as an attack on the authority of the Bible. If it's not God's word handed down by God in an immaculate form, then saying that there were multiple authors which give different accounts really challenges the authority that they put into the writing. So this view was banned by the Catholic Church from being taught. And this ban was lifted actually in the middle of this past century, the 20th century. There's views of sub-authors, like other authors who may have contributed little bits into the J source. There's a K, an L, an S source. Some people question whether E actually existed or not because J and E work so well together. Some argue J is not a product of the early monarchy, that it was written later during the exile, potentially. Even though there are very different views, very much like there are very different views on Jesus, there are very different views on Gandhi, there are very different views on abortion. Even though there are very different views, the most commonly held view is that there are 4 different sources for the formation of the Pentateuch, which is specifically the documentary hypothesis. It's the general explanation. It's the best one that we have until archaeological evidence or someone finds something that's being overlooked by other scholars and theologians. So other strategies of form criticism. There are smaller units in each source, and they recognize the sources constructed from other sources or pre-existing traditions. As we'll get more into the more we go into these videos, there are ideas which are very much borrowed from other Near Eastern traditions and religious beliefs. There are different editors, redactors, that are involved in the creation of these stories. We'll see instances of these in the New Testament once we get there, like with the Gospel of John. But they are still included as part of the creative design. So it's very dynamic and very structured. It's not necessarily mechanical, but this is redaction criticism. So this is all believed to have been put together at a school that lasted several centuries, very much suited for the D and P authors, and it's found in other writings, like in the book of Ezekiel. So there's other books that we can look at that really lend credence to this belief that documentary hypothesis is legitimate. So that's all we've got today. Thank you for paying attention this long. Follow me on Twitter, MWONEII, like my Facebook page, facebook.com/YouSayThatIam. You can contribute to my Patreon page if you like, so I can put out these videos and my podcast more frequently. Patreon.com/MWONEII. Check out my writings from Patheos. Check out my book, You Say That I Am, Jesus and the Messianic Problem. And please subscribe if you would like to learn more. Thank you so much.